For most of his life, Tesla studied electricity, but in his final years, he became obsessed with something else. What happens to consciousness the moment the body stops? Not as philosophy, but as measurable signal displacement. He believed death was not the end, but a phase shift into a system built long before us. And what he found was so disturbing, it was locked away for nearly a century. By the 1930s, Nikola Tesla had become a man no longer interested in the world most people could see. The public still clung to the image of him as the eccentric inventor. Wireless energy, oscillators, towers that touched the sky. But quietly, in hotel rooms and locked storage vaults, Tesla was moving in a direction no one expected. He had begun to speak less about current and more about consciousness, less about how energy moves through wires, and more about how something else moves through the body. This wasn't spiritualism. Tesla loathed superstition. He called seances a distraction and dismissed most mysticism as intellectual laziness. But at some point, around 1931, according to suppressed correspondence, his experiments shifted. Not in theory, but in target. He no longer asked how to transmit energy through the earth. He asked whether the mind itself could be transmitted, whether what we call the soul had a waveform, a frequency, a resonance signature measurable in the physical world. He wasn't the only one asking. Around the same time, intelligence agencies, both foreign and domestic, began quietly monitoring Tesla's writings, not for military patents, but for something far more elusive: data related to post-death consciousness phenomena. A 1934 memo, buried inside FBI archives, makes reference to Tesla's Category D notebooks, a set of black journal entries written entirely in cipher, containing, as one agent noted, non-electrical theories of phase transition phenomena. Most of these notebooks have never surfaced, but the few pages that have, uncovered by a researcher who was later threatened into silence, reveal that Tesla believed the human being was not a closed biological system. He viewed it as an antenna, a receiver, and, more disturbingly, a transmitter. He proposed that consciousness, as we know it, is not produced by the brain at all, but simply channeled through it, much like a radio tuning into a station that exists whether the radio is on or not. He claimed to have found mathematical evidence that something persists after the signal is no longer tethered to the body. But what truly unsettled him wasn't the idea of survival. It was what that signal passes through next. Tesla began referring, cryptically, to a mirror field, a kind of dimensional membrane that surrounded physical matter, where signals went immediately after death. He suggested it was not static, not empty, and not always passive. These were not the ramblings of a broken man. His notes were meticulous, cross-referenced with his earlier work in oscillation, magnetism, and resonance. He mapped the body's electrical signature at rest and in moments of death-adjacent unconsciousness. And what he found, repeatedly, was that something exited, briefly altered the field around the body, and left a trace. A measurable one. Tesla's notes on these experiments stopped abruptly in late 1942. By January 1943, he was dead. The FBI seized everything. But what few people know is that 5 fragments survived, scattered, smuggled, preserved in the margins of stolen correspondence. And they reveal the 5 chilling truths Tesla believed about what happens after we die. Tesla's first revelation was simple, but terrifying in its implications. He no longer believed that consciousness was contained, not in the brain, not in the nervous system, not in any anatomical structure. Instead, he came to see the human being as a complex frequency matrix, a temporary convergence of signals, each tuned to a precise resonance that gave the illusion of individuality. When the body dies, he believed, the signal doesn't vanish. It migrates. This was the foundation of what Tesla began calling, in ciphered notes, the transitional frequency. It wasn't a metaphor. He meant a literal migration of waveforms from one vibrational state to another, just like a carrier wave changing frequency without losing its encoded information. He compared it to how radio stations fade as you drive out of range, not because the signal stops, but because your receiver is no longer tuned to it. In his view, the body was never the source. It was just the tuner. Tesla theorized that at the moment of death, the conscious self detaches from the physical broadcast system of the brain and begins resonating at a higher frequency band, one which overlaps with, but is invisible to, our material reality. This wasn't based on belief. It came from experiments he conducted on people in altered states, those unconscious, in near-death conditions, and in some cases, animals at the point of death. In each instance, Tesla believed he had detected what he described as non-electrical persistence, a signature that continued briefly after all known biological functions had ceased. To prove it, he built a device that was never patented and never discussed publicly. A kind of resonance chamber, not to send signals, but to record fluctuations in ambient field strength during biological death events. It didn't detect heat. It didn't detect electrical discharge. It recorded subtle oscillations in the Schumann resonance band, something Tesla had long studied as Earth's natural electromagnetic hum. And, according to fragments of his private notes, during one experiment, he recorded an anomaly. The field strength shifted for 4.3 seconds after cardiac death. It was not random. It followed a pattern, and then, like a ripple, it faded, but not down to zero. It faded into a new baseline. Tesla couldn't measure within the known electromagnetic spectrum. Something had left, but it had not stopped. What disturbed him wasn't just that the consciousness migrated. It was what it migrated into. He began to speak in tightly encrypted language about the existence of a secondary field, a subtle but intelligent frequency band that surrounds and permeates physical matter, accessible only to signals no longer bound by biology. He believed this field might be structured, contained, possibly built. He called it the mirror layer, not because it reflects light, but because it reflects intention. What entered it, he claimed, was shaped by what it carried. Rage, despair, confusion. These left a different signature than clarity, silence, or self-awareness. The signal didn't just pass through. It interacted. He never shared this with the public, not because he feared ridicule. He had endured that all his life, but because he feared it might be true. If consciousness was not annihilated, but transitioned, then the question was no longer, what comes next? The real question was, who built the next thing? And, more disturbingly, does it respond? There are notes, half-burned, never formally archived, that hint at Tesla's growing concern that the transitional frequency was not a one-way migration, that something on the other side was capable of reaching back. He became increasingly private, paranoid, some said. But his journals show a different picture. He wasn't unraveling. He was retreating, studying, listening to the hum of frequencies that most people didn't even know existed, because he believed that death was not an ending. It was a handoff, a transfer of signal from one field to another, a migration from one architecture into a larger one, designed to receive, not merely contain. This wasn't mysticism, it was signal theory. But the implications were spiritual in the most direct and unavoidable sense. Because if your signal doesn't stop when you die, then your life isn't just a biological accident. It's a tuning process, a preparation. And what you resonate with in this world may determine where and how you resonate in the next. That was the first truth Tesla saw, and it changed everything that followed. Once Tesla accepted that consciousness migrates like a signal, he was forced to confront a deeper implication, one that unraveled everything the medical and scientific world believed about the self. If the signal continues after death, then the signal cannot originate in the body. This is where he diverged permanently from the scientific community of his time. For them, identity was chemical, neurons firing, synapses connecting, an illusion of self generated by the brain's electrochemical dance. But Tesla had already measured too much. He'd observed signals that survived the end of biology. He'd detected resonance fields where there should have been silence. And slowly, inevitably, he concluded, identity is not local. It does not reside in the skull. It does not originate in the brain. What we call the self, the I behind the eyes, is not stored inside a body. The body is simply the hardware, temporary, replaceable. The software, the self, is elsewhere, non-local, transmitted in, not generated within. Tesla began referring to this idea privately as displaced origin, a state in which the source of your awareness exists outside the structure that expresses it. Much like a radio does not produce the music it plays, your mind does not create your being. It only receives it, filters it, and modulates it into action. When the receiver dies, the source remains untouched. That single insight changed how he saw everything: death, memory, even madness. He began reviewing case studies, some private, some passed to him by physicians who trusted his discretion. Patients with severe brain trauma who lost parts of their cognitive function but still retained a persistent self-awareness. People with no access to memory, language, or personality, yet they reported a clear, intact sense of I am. Tesla believed this was evidence of non-local consciousness. The local interface had broken, but the signal remained active, hovering behind the wreckage. He began mapping cases of split brain patients, dissociative disorders, and near-death experiences. He wasn't interested in psychology. He was hunting for the moment the system disconnected from its housing, and what happened when it did. In one private document, now believed lost, Tesla outlines a theory that the true self exists as a standing wave anchored in a field outside of space-time, modulated into temporal experience by the constraints of physical form. According to this model, birth is not the beginning of the self, and death is not its end. Both are just aperture shifts, moments where the tuner narrows or expands, and the implications were staggering. Because if your identity isn't housed in your brain, then your memories, your intuition, your deep inner knowing, none of it is truly yours in the personal sense. It is part of a larger field, a kind of soul architecture that exists beyond the limits of personal memory. Tesla believed that your so-called personality was just a shadow of that larger form, an echo, a local translation of a non-local structure. He believed this was why certain people had flashes of genius, or inexplicable fear, or sudden spiritual awakenings. They weren't hallucinating. They were remembering, not from this life, but from the larger field their true identity belonged to, only glimpsed when the biological filters weaken. Trauma, fasting, near death, sleep, shock. These weren't breakdowns. They were moments when the interface faltered, and the raw signal leaked through. He stopped calling these experiences anomalies. He began calling them leaks, and that terrified him more than death itself. Because if identity is non-local, then the brain is not the origin of self. It's a boundary, a limiter, a cage that keeps you from hearing too much, remembering too much, seeing too much too soon. Tesla believed the reason most people cannot perceive the field beyond is because they are too deeply tethered to the interface. The body filters not only perception, but access. But when that tether breaks, through death or certain technologies or even trauma, the field opens, and not everything inside it is passive. He suspected that much of what we call supernatural phenomena, ghosts, voices, presences, are not out there, but are simply bleed-through events, pockets where the interface thins and the non-local layers press in. Not all of them are friendly. Tesla was not romantic about this. He warned privately that the non-local field was filled with signals, not all of them yours, and unless your internal tuning is precise, your death won't be a clean migration. It could be an interception. This is why, in his final months, he returned obsessively to silence. Not as withdrawal, but as calibration. He believed that stillness, real, internal stillness, was the only way to tune the body back to its original frequency. Not to amplify the signal, but to hear it clearly before the tuner breaks. He feared that most people, having never heard their true signal clearly, would die not knowing who they really are. And if your soul doesn't know its own tone, it may not return to its source. It may get lost in the static. And that, Tesla believed, was the real danger of a world addicted to noise. If Tesla was right, that consciousness is non-local and that identity is streamed into the body like a signal, then the question no longer becomes whether the soul survives death. The question becomes, what does it pass through to reach what's next? And here, Tesla's thinking took a darker turn. Based on countless experiments with oscillation fields, electromagnetic thresholds, and what he referred to as interference harmonics, Tesla began to suspect there exists a transitional layer between this world and whatever lies beyond it. A frequency boundary. Not a gate, not a tunnel, but a mirror. He described it not in mystical terms, but as a reflective zone, a band of vibration where the soul, in shedding its physical interface, encounters something it does not expect. Itself distorted. Tesla believed this mirror layer was not some poetic metaphor, but a field, an actual vibratory threshold, that behaves like a lens curved inward. As the human soul exits the body's influence, it enters a space that reflects its own unresolved patterns, amplified and unfiltered. Every distortion, fear, belief, and attachment is no longer moderated by the physical brain. There are no buffers, no subconscious to hide behind. Only raw consciousness, faced with its own signal. This is not heaven. This is not judgment. This is resonance. According to Tesla's model, the mirror layer behaves like a resonance trap. It doesn't block passage. It simply reflects so completely that many become transfixed. Instead of continuing through, The disembodied soul can become caught, looping, replaying, revisiting emotional frequencies it never resolved in life. Not because something stops it, but because something mirrors it so precisely that the soul can't distinguish between what is real and what is residual. He believed this field accounted for hauntings, for spiritual apparitions, for the sensations people report during near-death states, beings watching them, places eerily familiar but altered, a sudden overwhelming confrontation with themselves. Not a life review, a resonance echo. Tesla tested this idea not by spiritual methods, but through sound and electromagnetism. He constructed harmonic chambers designed to simulate these thresholds, using layered coils to mimic the energetic signatures of the dying brain. In multiple trials, kept hidden from the public, he reported that test subjects experienced a rapid cascade of emotional and psychological archetypes, childhood memories, buried fears, flashes of unknown places, and, most disturbingly, voices that mimicked loved ones, but said things those people never would. He came to believe that the mirror layer doesn't just reflect, it adapts, it responds, not as a being, not as an intelligence, but as a field of pure informational feedback. It doesn't lie, but it doesn't clarify either. It shows you yourself, just not the version you recognize, the version that has been distorted by every compromise, every false belief, every survival mechanism built into your personality. It is here, he wrote, that most souls become afraid. Not because they are punished, but because they are suddenly seen, completely, and are unprepared for that level of exposure. Tesla's theory suggested that successful passage through the mirror layer required resonance purity, not moral perfection, not religious belief, just coherence, an alignment between the signal of who you believe you are and the deeper frequency of who you really are. And if those two are too far apart, the reflection becomes unbearable. He speculated that many get trapped here, not permanently, but cyclically, re-entering physical life or being drawn to familiar patterns in an effort to resolve the dissonance they couldn't face in the mirror. And this, he thought, might explain not only the recurrence of souls into similar lives, but also why trauma and dysfunction seem to concentrate in certain lineages, certain places. The mirror doesn't impose that return. The soul chooses it, trying to harmonize what was distorted. Tesla's writings on this field were sparse, intentionally. He was cautious, not because he feared disbelief, but because he feared misuse. If the mirror layer was real, it could be manipulated. If a signal could be trapped by resonance, it could be targeted. In private letters, he hinted at the possibility that this layer had been discovered before, perhaps known to ancient mystics or hidden orders, and that entire belief systems may have been designed to influence the moment of reflection, to shape what you see, and thus what you choose. In his view, this made the mirror not just a passage, but a vulnerable window, a moment where consciousness could be steered, even if subtly. He became obsessed with helping individuals align their inner frequencies before death. Not through technology, but through discipline, silence, attention, disidentification from emotional loops. He no longer saw preparation for death as religious. He saw it as technical, as signal hygiene, as clearing the lens so the mirror wouldn't distort. And in his final months, he wrote of a terrifying realization. Most people were not preparing at all. They were layering themselves in noise, beliefs not their own, emotions not fully felt, memories filtered through fantasy and shame. He feared that when their time came, the mirror would not reflect truth, but confusion, and they would stay, repeating, not as punishment, but as inertia. If the soul is a signal, what happens when that signal is interrupted? Tesla believed the journey of consciousness after death wasn't a straight line. It was subject to the same principles that govern all energy: frequency, interference, and decay. And he was convinced that not every soul completes its transition. Some remain, not by divine sentence, but by interference. In his later notes, buried under layers of unrelated equations, Tesla made repeated references to what he called resonance capture zones, regions of space, often near high trauma events or emotionally charged architecture, where the surrounding frequency was so chaotic that it disrupted the soul's ability to pass cleanly through the mirror layer. He wasn't speaking poetically. He meant this in measurable terms: interference fields formed by prolonged human suffering, obsessive memory, or repeated energetic feedback loops. In simpler words, places and people saturated with unresolved pain. These areas, he theorized, create echo chambers. When a soul exits the body in one of these zones, its signal, already vulnerable, is pulled sideways, caught in the residual frequencies of other unfinished signals. He called it consciousness diffraction. Instead of passing forward, the signal splits. Not entirely, not fatally, but just enough to become trapped between two states: aware but not embodied, detached but not ascended. And these fragments, these echoes, become what we experience as hauntings, ancestral attachments, or even psychological phenomena that linger across generations. Tesla believed they weren't full souls, but stalled transmissions, identities frozen in feedback loops they no longer understand. But not all interference came from the environment. Some came from within. According to Tesla's model, strong emotional anchors, grief, guilt, fear, don't just disturb the living, they tether the dead. If a person dies with overwhelming fixation on something left undone, or with a fractured identity built on illusion, that mental signature continues broadcasting. It's not enough to move on. The signal wants to resolve. And so it stays. Not as a ghost in the mythic sense, but as a frequency trying to finish a sentence it never had the clarity to complete. Tesla wasn't afraid of this phenomenon, but he was deeply concerned by our blindness to it. He believed our modern world was creating more of these interference patterns than ever before, through constant emotional suppression, shallow distractions, and the complete denial of inner stillness. He even hinted that some institutions may be unknowingly engineering interference, filling hospitals, schools, and cities with electromagnetic chaos and psychological trauma, creating spiritual bottlenecks. Places where consciousness not only fails to escape, but forgets it was ever meant to. And so, in the end, it wasn't death he feared. It was the noise. The soul, he believed, was never trapped by darkness, only by too many signals at once, none of them its own. And if you've ever felt something watching you, not evil, not angry, just confused, it might not be your imagination. It might be someone still trying to finish their transmission. In his final, most guarded writings, Tesla proposed something few were prepared to hear. Not only is rebirth real, but it's not mystical at all. It's mechanical. He came to believe that reincarnation wasn't a grand spiritual cycle of learning, but the consequence of failing to maintain signal coherence after death. Not a reward, not a punishment, just physics. According to his private theory, when a soul passes through the mirror layer, it must hold its frequency with enough clarity to escape the Earth's resonant field. If it cannot, if it's still broadcasting unresolved emotional patterns, attachments, or beliefs, it is automatically reattracted back into the vibrational density of material life, like gravity for the psyche. Tesla called this the return gate, not a doorway, but a magnetic feedback loop, a kind of default setting in the structure of the universe where dissonant signals return to physical form simply because they haven't finished stabilizing. He warned this gate is indifferent. It doesn't care about justice, lessons, or spiritual growth. It only reflects whether your signal can escape its own noise. And here's the disturbing part. He hinted that the gate could be interfered with, that certain systems, whether intentional or accidental, are amplifying the emotional noise that keeps souls returning, not evolving, just rebooting, over and over again. He feared modern life wasn't just spiritually hollow. It was engineered to make return inevitable. Every unresolved trauma, every inherited belief, every distraction from silence, all of it feeding into a system that makes it harder, not easier, to leave the loop. In a note found scribbled on the back of a schematic, he wrote just 5 words: no signal, no escape, return. Tesla's final conclusion was that freedom from the cycle would not come through external salvation, religious allegiance, or even scientific discovery. It would come through internal resonance purification, because if the universe is a field of vibration, then your life, every thought, every act, is the signal you're sculpting for your exit. And the return gate. It doesn't open or close, it just listens. This wasn't a theory for Tesla. Death, to him, was not an end. It was a corridor, structured, layered, and disturbingly engineered. A series of filters, gates, and fields that didn't feel accidental. They felt designed. And what haunted him most wasn't the science behind it. It was the silence surrounding it. Because if the soul is measurable, if its departure leaves signatures, then someone, somewhere, has always known. Tesla's experiments weren't just electrical, they were existential. He didn't build machines to light up cities. He built them to map the threshold, that invisible zone between this life and what comes next. And what he found there didn't look like heaven or hell or nothingness. It looked like a closed system, a loop, where consciousness tries to escape, but keeps falling back in, guided not by moral law or cosmic love, but by frequency fields, resonance patterns, and memory structures. This is why he abandoned his earlier optimism. In his youth, he spoke of progress and invention. But in his final years, he began to speak only of distortion, of noise in the system, of intelligence misused, of signals hijacked. He came to believe that modern humanity was not evolving toward freedom, but drifting further into resonance captivity. That the more distracted we became, the more mechanical the return. That the death process had been subtly rewritten, by natural law or perhaps by something else entirely, to trap energy in patterns of repetition. And if that's true, then death is not the question we should fear. Escape is, because according to Tesla, rebirth is not a clean slate, it's an echo, a reboot of unfinished data. And if you return carrying the same unresolved frequencies, trauma, denial, dependency, you're not born, you're reinserted into the same field with a different name, which raises the most disturbing implication of all. What if the feeling of being born for a reason is real, but the reason was installed? What if this isn't evolution, but captivity? And what if the cycle continues not because we're failing, but because the system is working exactly as intended? Tesla never shared these ideas publicly. He knew they would be dismissed, distorted, or worse, used. But in the margins of his later notebooks, he left patterns, hints, questions buried in formulas, a blueprint not for a device, but for a departure, a way to leave without returning. But that path requires silence. It requires memory. It requires resisting the noise that calls itself progress. Because when death is a circuit, the only way out is disconnection. And if you've ever felt it, just beneath the surface of your life, a quiet hum that says you've been here before, you may not be imagining it. You may be remembering the loop, and the fact that you're sensing it now means you're already closer to the edge than most. But edges are dangerous things, because if you press too far, you don't just find what's behind the veil, you find out who put it there.